detecting a massive object emerging from hyperspace.
Avengers Endgame is quickly on pace to become the #1 highest grossing movie of all time, already beating out Titanic in only its second weekend. And I wanted to take a look at both series and ask the question, which one is more influential in the world today, and is Star Wars still the juggernaut that it used to be? Starting off with a very simple question of which series has more, Marvel clearly comes out on top. Star Wars has a total of 11 movies, 12 if you count The Rise of Skywalker, and it will have that amount at the end of 2019. Contrast that with the MCU, which has currently 22 movies and will have 23 at the end of 2019. Now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has avoided one key feature that the Star Wars universe has, and that is the issue of fatigue. Something that a lot of fans have stated, especially after the release of Solo, a Star Wars story, is that Star Wars needs to slow down and not make as many movies. Contrast that with Marvel, especially the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and no one has ever complained that Marvel is making too many movies. And if you are, it often is because you're behind on watching them. I mean, I just like to compare two movies from both series, both movies that were largely seen as inconsequential and non-important to the overall story of each respective series, and that is Captain Marvel and Solo, a Star Wars story. Now, both were seen as completely useless to the overall story. I mean, they affect literally nothing in previous or upcoming movies, and so it begged the question, why did these happen? But Solo only managed to make a little over 300 million. In fact, it didn't even break 400 million for a movie that was entirely reshot with a different set of directors and with a suspected budget of $500 million, barely making just under 400 million is awful. They didn't break even at all. In fact, I had several friends just saying that they were just going to wait for DVD to come out or wait till it dropped on Netflix. When you compare that with Captain Marvel, a movie which many people thought the same things as Solo, it wasn't needed. We don't really need this for Endgame. This movie made over $1 billion in the global box office. And when we look at the movie Solo, a movie that was largely seen as non-essential, inconsequential, and didn't affect the greater Star Wars universe, and it was just a small story that was unneeded, and then having that story preceded by a largely divisive Star Wars movie, The Last Jedi. I mean, it's obvious to see that Star Wars clearly isn't doing as well in theaters as they want to. We had the boycott and backlash after The Last Jedi, and people said that it wouldn't affect Solo, and it clearly did. People didn't want to see Solo. And of course, a backlash like this has never plagued the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with people showing up in droves to go see every new Marvel movie, myself included. Now I need to talk about the quality of each of the Marvel and Star Wars movies, which is a completely different topic altogether, but I believe that it's an important one if we're really analyzing a competition between the series over whether or not one is more influential over the other. Now, just again, it's really important to mention that Solo had a backlash and boycott of after the release of The Last Jedi, and that can be due in part to Rian Johnson, who has gone on record before, several years ago and even very recently, that he likes his movies to be divisive, where he wants half the fans to say, I love it, and half the fans to say, I hate it.
Worried if everybody across the board was like, yeah, that was a good movie. It's much more exciting to me when you get, a group of people who are like coming up to you and really, really excited about it. And then there are other people who walk out literally saying that was the worst movie I've ever seen. Having those two extremes to me is the mark of the type of movie that I want to make.
Contrast that with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where no one ever in the MCU has said to themselves, we need to make a divisive film that shakes up the fan base.
It's very rare as a storyteller to get to make movies like this that bind people together. There's a real sense of community behind these films. The global reach is significant.
And while admittedly some movies, especially Avengers Endgame, can fall into the route of just pleasing fans with copious amounts of fan service, I think that it's deserved and it's well written into the story. Whereas the last movie to have fan service for Star Wars was Episode 7, The Force Awakens, which is largely criticized for the fact that it was a beat-for-beat remake of A New Hope. And while we're on the topic of fan service and remakes, a beat-for-beat remake that is, let's talk about Doctor Strange, a movie which has been partially criticized for the fact that Doctor Strange is essentially just a magical Iron Man, which I would have to agree with, except that several of the story beats are completely different. The movie might seem a little formulaic, but it always will mix things up and introduce new elements. And while it's true that a lot of Marvel movies, especially the Marvel movies in Phase 1, tend to be a bit formulaic with following roughly the same plot, it's a complaint that's been around for Marvel for a long time. It's never stopped bringing people to the theaters. There hasn't been a single one of Marvel's movies where the majority of fans took a look at it and said, you know what, I'll pass. But Star Wars 1980, you fantastic fountain of well-articulated knowledge, I hear you say. What about all the shows, books, comics, and video games that Star Wars has? Well, it's true. If we take a look outside of solely just movies, there is a lot more in Star Wars to unpack. Unfortunately, it's nothing that Marvel really doesn't have. And honestly, Marvel tends to be doing a better job. While I'm not here to critique Marvel Comics, the 616 universe, I'm here to critique the Marvel Cinematic Comics that are often tie-ins to the movies, and these comics are basically inconsequential. They're really just made to sell copies. There's really nothing interesting or special. If you just go and watch the movie as is, you're going to be filled in with everything you need to know. So that's what I have to say about that. And while I do agree that the comics for Star Wars are better than the Marvel Cinematic Universe comics, I think that's one tick for Star Wars in a fairly one-sided argument against it. Star Wars does have video games, something that the Marvel Cinematic Universe can't claim. I mean, there were an Iron Man and a Hulk video game, you know, those movie to video game adaptations way back in the very beginning, but I'm really not going to count those because they're nowhere near recent, and comparing them would honestly be a bit unfair. And yet, despite this seemingly clear edge that Star Wars would have over Marvel, it seems that even their video games can't stop from being divisive. With only 2 real video games being released in the 5 years that EA has had the rights to Star Wars, with Battlefront and Battlefront 2, the first game criticized for lack of content, and the second one criticized for being a money-grabbing machine. And while true, it did turn itself around, Battlefront 2 took a year to do so, and so I believe that all the criticisms that were levied against it upon launch should be brought up in any future debate regarding EA and their video game license. On the subject of shows, Marvel shows boast a large array, especially the several Netflix shows, Daredevil, Luke Cage, Jessica Jones, Iron Fist, The Defenders, and The Punisher, along with several TV shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and multiple others that honestly I don't watch because there's a lot right now. And while admittedly I'm not very knowledgeable on the inner workings of each and every series, I can appreciate the fact that, especially the Netflix shows, they're critically very well received with the exception of Iron Fist. In canon, Star Wars has Star Wars The Clone Wars, Star Wars Rebels, Star Wars Resistance, and Forces of Destiny, along with several other shows that are coming out. But one thing all of these shows have in common, save one of them, is that they are not the Clone Wars. See, with each new series that Marvel pumps out, fans will go and watch, just the same as movies. With every single new movie that Marvel pumps out, fans are going to go and watch. But with every single new show that Star Wars comes out with, there's always the exact same criticism that is always levied against it, and that is, it's not as good as Clone Wars. And for those of you who are saying that it's just angry fanboys who are saying this, I believe it's very clear that Star Wars film, or TV, peaked with Star Wars The Clone Wars. And they have been trying to replicate that ever since. They've even gotten Dave Filoni on board with everything. But it's very clear that fans want to see The Clone Wars, which I believe is a large reason for why it was renewed for its 7th and last season. See, issues of divisiveness don't plague the Marvel Cinematic Universe fans like it does Star Wars. We can argue all the livelong day that Star Wars is the bigger and better series, but ultimately when we look at the fans, we look at the reception of each movie, show, comic, game, and everything, put it all together, it shows that Marvel is way ahead of Star Wars at the moment. I know, if we were to go back 10 years, 15 years, Even if we were to go back before the release of episode 1, back to 1998, and we were to ask people, what do you think is going to be bigger in the next 20 years? Star Wars or Marvel? People would have been like, Marvel? You mean the guys who made Blade? I mean, the fact that Solo, a Star Wars story, was outperformed at the global box office by Ant-Man and the Wasp, fun movie by the way, is just ridiculous to me. I mean, it's becoming very clear that the demographics are changing, and Star Wars is not the juggernaut that it was. To me, it will always be my favorite series out there, and I'm sure to many of you, you'll agree. But unfortunately, Marvel seems to be taking the leaps ahead that Star Wars is not. Now, Marvel also does have the added advantage of not having half of its lore ripped out of it when it was bought by Disney, which is something that Star Wars did have. But the fact remains is that Star Wars is an incredibly divisive series that struggles to bring new fans to the theater for movies that should be easy box office cash, and Marvel does not. It is possible to love both. I myself love both. I always see every one of their movies opening weekend as to avoid spoilers. But I can't deny that Marvel is leaps and bounds ahead of Star Wars at the moment. Could The Rise of Skywalker change this? It's possible, but with no movies coming out after it until 2022, and Marvel coming out with their first movie after Endgame already in the same season, it seems unlikely that Star Wars will remain the juggernaut that it once was. Star Wars will always be number one for me, but I can't deny what the rest of the world thinks. Well, guys, thanks for watching. I don't know if you agree. It was a bit of a hard video to make because honestly, I knew that a lot of fans are going to be displeased with what I have to say, but it's something I think that needs to be said. And hopefully, if the right people see this, which I know they won't, change can happen. So what are your thoughts? Let me know what you think. Do you think that Star Wars is still bigger than Marvel, or do you think that Marvel has really just taken the spot as the #1 series worldwide? Make sure you guys go see Avengers Endgame. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you again next time.